Welcome back, folks, for the third installment of The Rise of Industry. I am Miss Jennifer Blank, and I will be your guide on this journey. So today we are talking about important people, okay? Some key titans of industry, if you will, that you need to be aware of. But before we get into the important people, we need to just review some vocab. We need some key vocab, as always. So pause the video, copy this down, so that you know what it is. Now, you can see this show up on some of your standardized tests, this concept of robber baron, or sometimes known as a captain of industry, a titan of industry. Those are phrases you could see. They're all referring to effectively the same people. But just so you know, so pause the video, copy that stuff down. Important stuff. Okay, so let's give you some historical context here. Competition and consolidation. So one of these industries that we're going to talk about is the railroads. The railroads were overbuilt, some were unprofitable. There was widespread mismanagement and fraud. Now remember, the construction of the railroads was in part facilitated by the federal government via cheap land and some infrastructure developments that helped the railroads get going. But despite this, there was mismanagement and there was fraud. There were speculators. One such speculator was Jay Gould, who made quick profits by selling off assets and watering stock. Basically, they inflated the value of the assets and the profits. They lied effectively, and then they sold it to the public. And then once the public bought it, they became aware that this was a lie, but by that point, the damage was already done. The values came back to earth and people lost tons of money. Not Jay Gould, though. Guys like Jay Gould made out like bandits. They screwed the rest of the economy to help themselves. Unfortunately, we still have some of those floating about in our economy today. Now, they also offered rebates and kickbacks to favored shippers. Farmers had to pay higher prices, which was a major problem because agriculture is our biggest industry, so that was a major issue. You also had pools. Competing companies agreed to secretly fix prices and share business. Okay, this was part of another like monopolistic trend. Okay, so you need to be aware this stuff was happening. Okay, so what happened? So we have this panic of 1893. We're going to talk about a few different economic panics, but the panic of 1893 was particularly important. One quarter, 25% of all railroads went into bankruptcy. They couldn't make it. J.P. Morgan and other bankers took control and consolidated the railroads. They stabilized rates and reduced debts. By 1900, though, only 7 giant systems controlled 2/3 of the railroads. So you don't have much competition here. You also had interlocking directorates. Some directors ran competing companies. Okay, and then you got regional railroad monopolies. And as we learned from the last video, monopolies are bad. They're bad. They destroy the free market. So let's talk about some important people. So Samuel Morse invented the telegraph. George Westinghouse through Nikola Tesla invented AC electricity. We got Thomas Edison with the light bulb. Listen, you can read this, okay? You can read this on your own. But these are the important people you should be aware of. I'm not going to talk about every single one of these people. I'm just going to kind of hit the highlights, but these are some important people that you should know about. Okay, and then technology and inventions. You guys can read that too. Like, I don't need to read this to you. We're big enough, right? But these were some important things. So these are the calculating machine, the adding machine preludes to the eventual computer. But that, of course, comes much later. Okay, so Edison and Westinghouse. These guys were competing. Okay, these guys were competing. So Thomas Edison was basically an invention factory. He had Nikola Tesla actually worked for Thomas Edison. Just putting that out there. And there were more than 1,000 patents that came out of his company, and those are just some of the inventions. He had a lot of inventors working for him. George Westinghouse had more than 400 patents. He came up with the air brake for the railroad. It's going to be really important for subways eventually. And then the transformer for electric current. That's very important. Widespread electricity, not possible without that transformer. So that was really important. Okay, so here, these are the titans of industry, or captains of industry, robber barons, you might call them as well. The big five, I call them. Henry Ford, Cornelius Vanderbilt, John D. Rockefeller, and J.P. Morgan. Now, I'm not going to go into super huge detail because, as you see, there's a link up here. I'm going to post this PowerPoint. I want you guys to go to these links, and it shows you a little video about these guys. So I just wanted to point that out. Okay, I'm going to talk about them a little bit, but these little short videos are very, very instructive, and I think better than me at conveying this information to you. So Cornelius Vanderbilt, this guy was big in the shipping industry, okay, and he was the railroad. Vanderbilt was railroads. So do you need to memorize all of this? No, you don't. Here's historical context for him, but you need to know Cornelius Vanderbilt, railroad, Vanderbilt, railroad, Vanderbilt, railroad. Okay, those are you need to associate the Titan with his industry. Okay, that's what you need to memorize. Okay, just putting that out there. He was a very shrewd businessman. He was known for cutthroat tactics. It was kill or be killed, and he was doing a lot of killing. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Okay, Henry Ford, this guy, Model T. Okay, Ford, cars. Ford, cars. Henry Ford, automobile. Henry Ford, automobile. Okay, that's what you need to know. This guy made the first car for the average person. His goal was that the factory workers in his factories would be able to afford his cars. Now, this was not just altruistic, like, oh, what a nice guy. No, he knew that if they could afford his cars, they would buy his cars and he would make more money. So the goal was money, as it always is for the captains or titans of industry, or robber barons, if you will. Oh, before I forget, assembly line, huge, huge, because it didn't just stay in the automobile industry, it expanded out to all the factories. So this assembly line, pardon me, super huge idea. You got a Henry Ford assembly line, remember that. So Andrew Carnegie, steel, Carnegie, steel, Carnegie, okay? So just remember that. Carnegie steel was at top by 1900. And he started in the 1870s. So in 30 years, he had basically become his own monopoly. So that's important to note. This guy actually rose from nothing. Most of these other robber barons were, middle class or upper class even, and they were doing just fine. But Andrew Carnegie actually embodied the rags to riches idea. He was a poor Scottish immigrant, and he worked his way up. And that's how he became what he became. Carnegie also was important for this idea called the Gospel of Wealth. He wrote a document called the Gospel of Wealth. Okay, that's a very, very important idea. We're going to talk about that later on. He was a big devotee of philanthropy. Once he sold his company, he then decided to engage in charitable works. And the reason why we have public libraries in this country is Andrew Carnegie. He built a library in every city, and the public library movement spread beyond what he did initially, but we wouldn't have public libraries if it wasn't for Andrew Carnegie, so we can thank him for that. He was not great, and then he kind of felt bad about it and then tried to do something nice. So he's an interesting character, Andrew Carnegie. John D. Rockefeller, this guy. Oh, Rockefeller is not a nice guy. Rockefeller is not a good dude. And when you go to this link and watch this video about him, not a good guy, okay? He's oil. When you think Rockefeller, think oil. Rockefeller, oil, Rockefeller, okay? And we talked about the fact that he formed a trust with horizontal integration. So remember, Rockefeller Oil. Okay, let me move my camera guy. So this just breaks down how he was able to get what he got and able to horizontally integrate. He made secret deals with the railroad. They would charge him less for shipping, or he wouldn't sell oil to them, which of course they needed oil, so they had to agree to it. This allowed him to sell his oil cheaper than anyone else and effectively price everyone out of the market. Okay, so that's what he was able to do. So by 1880, Rockefeller owns 90% of oil businesses in the U.S., and that, of course, folks, is a monopoly, okay? Now, in 1911, there was a really, really important Supreme Court case that forced Standard Oil to actually separate and broke up the trust, okay? And this Sherman Antitrust Act was responsible for the ability of them to force Standard Oil to separate into 34 different companies, among other antitrust laws. So that 1911 Supreme Court case, that's really important. You need to remember that. And J.P. Morgan, this guy was always trying to please Daddy. Daddy was a big deal. So J.P. Morgan is like the epitome, born into a new wealthy family and followed his father into banking and built upon the wealth that his father had started. So this is not a rags to riches story. This is more typical of how people got rich in the country. They got rich because their daddy was rich and their daddy before them was rich. And that was much more the standard play. Banking. Morgan, banking. JP Morgan, banking, banking, JP Morgan. Okay, banking. Now, this guy was so rich, he loaned the federal government millions of dollars. Imagine being so rich that you can loan the federal government money. Like, just contemplate that for a minute, like how rich you have to be in order to do that. So, he bought Carnegie Steel and then created the U.S. Steel Corporation out of Carnegie Steel and made more money with that as well. All right, folks, that is the end of part 3. I hope you learned what you needed to, and I will see you next time. Remember, go check out those videos.